In a school not much different than this, 154 rounds of bullets flew through the hallway. At the end of the day, it would eventually kill 26 children and teachers. Now, almost a year later of the shooting that would later become known as the Sandy Hook Elementary shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, we find our country still fighting over the gun legislation. In today's broadcast, AP English language students, we will be exploring the unique perspective and demonstration of fear and bias that the American citizens have brought to this topic. We will talk to sources from all ranges of the spectrum, all the way from the far right to the radical left. Now, we will go live to our first interview. Joining us now is Hilary Anderson. She writes and speaks for the British Broadcasting Network and has individual experience with the victim's family of the Sandy Hook shooting. Hilary, how are you today?
I'm very good, Daniel. Very good.
Good. Can you tell us your views on the recent tragedy?
The events were obviously very tragic, Daniel. I spoke to the parents of a child named Daniel who was murdered in the events of the Sandy Hook shooting, and nothing really compares to the grief of losing a child. These families said goodbye to their children, and they were completely unaware that they wouldn't be tucking in their child that night. So completely tragic, and it just shows that it's too easy to access guns in this country.
How is it too easy to get guns in this country?
Well, depending on the state, Daniel, the gun legislation varies. However, at a gun fair, it may be too simple to purchase a gun from a private owner, such as the one I purchased from a private owner in Texas, where I was able to purchase the same gun that Adam Lanza used in the shooting in Connecticut. Now let's go to our correspondent, Robbie Maharis, on the rhetorical fallacies used in these sources.
The New York Times distracted readers with other hot-button topics such as drug legalization rather than fully discussing and debating the topic of gun control. They also used overgeneralization by stating that several states wanted to push back gun laws, but only mentioned 2 that want to do so. The Huffington Post reported that gun legalization has the chance of passing in both the Senate and the House, but they based their assumption off of the opinion of 3 Republicans, a far too small and biased sampling size to gauge the actual opinion of the House and Senate. This is an overgeneralization taken from a very small sample size. The Huffington Post also distracts their readers with several red herrings, the image of people buying a surplus of guns, and the victims' families to make the reader emotionally invested. A similar strategy was used in the LA Times article. They used red herrings such as personal accounts from victims and their families to make the reader emotionally invested as well. They don't actually talk about the gun legalization and only use these tools to distract the reader.
Let's take a look at the different kinds of media biases displayed in our news sources. The Huffington Post shows a political bias towards the Democratic Party by using messages such as pictures and context of the argument to help support the author. They showed angry pictures of the Republicans to persuade people into thinking that they are inferior to the Democratic Party. The author chose to omit discussing the Democratic opinions which side with Republican opinions on this issue. The BBC displays a bias towards nationalism. The article makes frequent comparisons to the way the UK handled the shootings in Dublin by talking about the Snowdrop campaign that ended the private possession of weaponry and the legislation that ensured safety in schools. The journalist compares the Newtown shooting to the Dublin shooting to say that the US can learn from Britain's prime example on how to rebuild a town from such a horrific disaster.
We have Elijah Crew with us to discuss his opinions on the Sandy Hook shooting. Elijah, how do you think the country is handling this tragedy?
Well, as a representative of the LA Times, I think that this country is handling the situation rather poorly. I believe that this was a foreseeable event that the government neglected to prevent.
Well, why do you believe that?
In 1996, the United States government discontinued the funding of a study that researched the connection between gun violence and the psychology behind it. The study tried to pinpoint certain factors and characteristics that would lead someone to act out in such a way. The $2.5 million were repurposed to other, more important funds.
Well, how do you think California would handle this tragedy?
Well, in the Golden State, there's an overwhelming majority in favor of not only a state, but a federal ban of assault weapons. We also believe that there should be more intensive background checks for people wishing to purchase firearms.
Thank you, Elijah.
We hope you enjoyed
Our Media Bias podcast.
We had a lot of fun creating the podcast.
And we can't wait for our next opportunity to
Expose the Views Behind the News.